Well, isn't this nice? A change from the usual belligerent types.
Hello lovelies. I really seem to have put the twat amongst the pigeons last night, don't I? Congratulations. If you're new to this channel, you are just discovering that I think for myself and that I don't fit really into any neat little box that you may have put me in or others may have put me in. Just because I agree with you on one particular issue doesn't mean that I will agree with you on every other issue. Hopefully you value this and my outspokenness. Rarely do I have a red line beyond which I think something is totally unacceptable, but they do turn up. And this whole Rittenhouse thing, like the COVID thing, is one of them. Rather than get embroiled in tons and tons and tons and tons of replies and questions and queries and outrage and teeth sucking, I thought I'd make a follow-up video just to cover some of the main thrusts of the points that some people are making or attempting to make. As I conceded in my previous video, I think some of the issues around all of this are cultural. British culture isn't perfect by any means. We have our own problems with idiots on either pole of the left-right political spectrum, and certainly have plenty of authoritarians. British culture isn't perfect, but it is deranged in different ways to the ones in which American culture is deranged. And American culture is particularly deranged around guns. And American culture is particularly deranged at the moment in terms of politicizing everything and making it all about tribal affiliation rather than the facts or scientific concerns, factual concerns, historical concerns, reality, truth concerns. Are you wearing the red scarf or the blue scarf? Which side are you on? I've been rewatching Babylon 5 recently, and it reminds me of the greens versus the purples when it comes to the Drazi. Our culture in Britain is different. Despite sharing a common language, this often confuses and enrages people. I don't think our culture is perfect, but on this matter I think it's at least better. Now, I've been in a situation where I've had to consider my self-defense. I was mugged, or attempted to be mugged. Fortunately, someone else came along. And following that, I tried to find myself a non-lethal weapon with which to defend myself if necessary in future, and had a lovely visit by the police. So I think our culture is in some ways too far in one direction, but American culture, when it comes to guns especially, and the idea of freedom to completely overriding everyone else's freedom from, I think America is not just too far, it is completely off the map. It is off amongst here be dragons having a little dance, and it's way out of line. But as I said, I admit that some of this may be down to a cultural issue, an outside context problem. American gun culture, American hyper-individualism, American utter fixation upon freedom too, without ever considering the impact that might have on other people's freedom from. That it's an outside context problem. It is not comprehensible to me in any real way, and this is despite sharing what should be a lot of ideological prompts with what is presumed to be American culture. So I concede some of this is a cultural problem, some of this is an outside context problem, but from my point of view, and attempting to be as objective and calm as possible American culture is utterly deranged on these topics. One thread of objection that seems to be quite common is the claim that I am somehow not an anarchist when I speak out against these egregious examples of placing personal individual freedom over concern for the community. This is why I tend to include left in my description of my anarchism. I am a left anarchist, not an anarcho-capitalist. The best way to sum up my view on anarchism is the quote from the comic version of V for Vendetta. Eve. All this riot and uproar, V. Is this anarchy? Is this the land of do as you please? V. No. This is only the land of take what you want. Anarchy means without leaders, not without order. With anarchy comes an age of Ordnung, or true order, which is to say voluntary order. This age of Ordnung will begin when the mad and incoherent cycle of Verwirrung that these bulletins reveal has run its course. This is not anarchy, Eve. This is chaos. So people, including a lot of anarcho-capitalists, don't seem to understand what anarchy is, what the principle behind anarchy is, and a lot of people demand absolute purity from their own ideological bedmates and from other people's ideologies. They seem to believe that anarchy is chaos, whether they're trying to condemn it or whether they're trying to extol its benefits. Regardless, we do not currently live under an anarchistic system. For me, anarchism is the point of the compass. Which way lies my ideological true north? And that is the greatest freedom for the greatest number of people. That, to me, is the boiled down absolute essence of anarchism. So is the greatest amount of freedom for the greatest number of people best served by having some constrictions on our individual rights for the sake of the collective rights of many, many other people? To an extent, yes. There are always exceptions. But by and large, the freedom of the greatest number of people is not served by the wholesale ownership of deadly firearms by any Tom, Dick or Harry that wants one. This shouldn't be that controversial a point. This is also why I tend to be for socialistic solutions within the political and social and technological and economic context in which we find ourselves, because those lend themselves to providing the greatest freedom for the greatest number of people. Case in point being a socialized healthcare system. Costs less, provides more, serves more people. A certain type of commentator likes to tell me that this is all the fault of the left, when the problems that we're largely facing seem to be primarily caused by either right-wing overreach or by people wearing the left as a skin suit. So if you're claiming that this is all the fault of the left, then you do not understand what the left is any more than you understand what anarchism is. The recent spate of unionizations maybe makes for a better case in point than things like this. Perhaps less emotive. What is the point of a union? The point of a union is to collectivize bargaining amongst the workers in a particular field or a particular company, so that they can collectively use their leverage to compete with the leverage that the owner class or manager class has. This leverage is then supposed to be used to argue for better terms and conditions of work, better compensation for one's labour, and so on. That would be a left-wing view of unionisation. However, what we seem to be seeing with the recent spate of unionisations at, say, Image Comics or Kickstarter is that they are squandering their leverage not to argue for better pay and conditions, but to demand some sort of ideological filter over what the company does. In the case of Kickstarter, what projects can be allowed on that platform. That's not left-wing. Identitarianism, other than I suppose you could argue on the basis of class and wealth, absolutism in the context of that identitarianism is much more associated with either the right or with authoritarianism, which isn't on the left-right axis. To centre race as being the most important to be all and end all is not a left-wing position. Wealth and class should be centred, and you can call me a class reductionist if you like, but that is the most important thing. And a lot of things that people write off as identitarian issues are in fact to do with wealth and class issues. People argue that this is somehow a clear-cut case of self-defense. If you believe that Rittenhouse acted in self-defense, then you must also believe that the rest of the people who were shot, attacking him, trying to tackle him, trying to remove his gun and so on, were also acting in self-defense. And you don't. So there is an inconsistency here, a very egregious inconsistency. Most of the shootings took place after he had already shot someone who viciously attacked him with a very sharp plastic bag. So the context you have to see there, surely, is that here is someone who has already shot someone in circumstances that would certainly have been at the very least muddy. And as far as any onlookers might have considered things to have been going, here was a dangerous lunatic with a rifle who was opening fire on people who were part of their protests. In which case, them intervening is an act of self-defense and a defense of others. Other people's lives, in fact, which is a far better excuse than the one you're accepting from Rittenhouse, which is that supposedly he was there to protect property that wasn't his, with a firearm he shouldn't have had at a time he shouldn't have been out on the street. Provocation. Provocation means it's no longer really self-defense now, is it? If I break into your house to steal your things, you take a pot shot at me and miss, and I return fire and kill you, that's not a case of self-defense. He went there when he shouldn't have, with a gun he shouldn't have had, again, and these are acts of provocation. These show a deliberate willingness to flout the law and to go and seek trouble. And that's what annihilates his claim of self-defense. All these steps he went through to put himself in harm's way and to get involved in a fight with an illegal gun, again, at a time he shouldn't have been out there. Showing reckless endangerment of all the people around him. You can't argue self-defense in that context any more than the burglar could for shooting the homeowner after they'd taken a shot at them. It is not self-defense in those kinds of cases of provocation. Circling back to American gun culture, which again I believe to be utterly and completely deranged, it's based on a whole bunch of false premises. The idea of this goes back to English common law, which you inherited from us. And this idea of wholesale gun ownership ignores the context of the amendment, the wording of the amendment, the historical place in which the amendment exists. The whole well-regulated militia part is utterly ignored, as is the fact that when it was written, America had no standing army. It now has a standing army, and the role of the militias is fulfilled by the National Guard. I mean, this derives from Old English law going back to when we didn't have a standing army, which didn't really happen until the 17th century. We also know that an armed society is not a polite society, Compare America with virtually any other civilized nation, or any civilized nation, if I'm being less charitable, and you can see that. Crime is much higher, death rates are much higher, suicide rates are much higher. Much of this is enabled by this insane wholesale gun ownership. People in America are denied so many basic things that would increase the rights and freedom of so many of them, in part because of the distraction of things like gun ownership, which is inexorably intertwined with the hyper-individualism and the pick yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. But the science is in, and this is over a span of decades and from many different sources, not just one. Wholesale gun ownership leads to worse outcomes for more people. You are much more likely to harm yourself or a loved one with a firearm that you own, rather than successfully defending yourself. In fact, bringing a gun into play, as I think we can see anecdotally in the Rittenhouse case, increases the likelihood of someone, you included, ending up hurt. It decreases your chance of surviving an encounter rather than increasing it. Why? I would hazard to guess because it ups the ante. When you have such a deadly weapon in play, suddenly it becomes much more important, much more viable that you end up being taken out before you hurt or kill someone else. I dare say if Rittenhouse hadn't had his rifle with him, he would not have attracted so many problems. He certainly wouldn't have killed anybody or elicited the reaction that came after that. He still shouldn't have been there, but even so, the gun, it seems to me, clearly worsened things. It didn't make them better. It upped the ante. The last main sort of string of argument, rather than insults and mask slips that I'm seeing, is that somehow these extrajudicial vigilante slayings were okay, because it turned out that the people who were shot happened to have been bad people. This is such an irrelevant argument, I don't know why anyone is making it. The argument here is about the principle. Is it okay for some 17-year-old idiot hopped up on Glenn Beck and Fox News to go out and murder people just because they turn out to be bad people, which he couldn't have known at the time? If I swerve off the road and plough into a bus line that turns out later to have been murderers on day release or something from prison, it doesn't magically render it okay that I just killed a bunch of people. Nor does it make it okay in this case. Even if he had known that they were bad people, one of them was a paedophile, it still wouldn't have been okay, and still would have been an extrajudicial slaying, and it still wouldn't have been okay. This is unacceptable, and you can't post hoc rationalize it, because he wouldn't have known at the time, and it wouldn't have been okay anyway. I don't know why anyone brings this up at all. Some of you don't like it that I mix content on my channel, but it's just me. I am an auteur. I don't want to juggle several channels. The kinds of people I want to listen to me, to consume the content that I create of various kinds, are people who won't throw a fit when I disagree with them, who don't expect me to be in 100% ideological lockstep with them at all times. Yeah, that's not me. It never will be. I don't fit into people's preconceived boxes, and my brand is me, and my brand is being outspoken. I found myself deliberately not commenting on this because I knew exactly what kind of reaction there would be, but eventually the sheer number of people I saw making excuses around all of this, around something that should never have happened, around this kid who, like it or not, did something utterly wrong. The amount of people excusing this became too much to bear, so I had to say something. And you're not convincing me otherwise with these piss-weak arguments. He had a gun he shouldn't have had, that he wasn't allowed to have, that it was illegal for him to have. He breached a curfew. He wasn't defending his own home or anything. He travelled to get there. He had an obvious firearm. And after the first shooting, the argument for self-defense is much more strongly held by the people who tried to run him down and relieve him of his gun than it is of him. And that's really all there is to say.